My name's Josh. I'm a co-host on the Imperfects, the son of Sri Lankan and English immigrants, and I grew up on and am now raising my children on Wurundjeri country. I'd like to recognise the traditional peoples of this continent whose land was stolen nearly 250 years ago. In particular, we at the Imperfects would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast was recorded, and we extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm inspired by the strength and endurance of the world's oldest living culture, and we at the Imperfects pay homage to the traditions of story when we share stories on our podcast.
Quick! Is anyone here a doctor? Yes, her name is Dr. Emily, and she's a psychologist. Please welcome to the Imperfects, our very own psychologist!
Here we are, back. Well, I'm not here. I'm actually not here, but we're back for another emisode. Dr. Emily. I'll clarify. I'm away. I'm out of the country, and via satellite. Imagine if we had a full crew doing a satellite cross for me. No, we don't. We have my computer. How are you guys? It's good to see you all.
Well, we're coming to you from Melbourne with Josh and I are in Melbourne with a very Melbourne, authentic Melbourne experience for you right now. Is that Josh is just really sick with something. Don't know what it is. He's just really sick.
Yep.
2 out of my 3 kids are really sick. I was up with sick kids all last night.
Oh.
So yeah, this is a very Melbourne experience for you right now, Ryan.
Yeah.
So I feel like everyone in Melbourne's sick right now.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone who's not.
Is anyone in Europe sick?
No, there's no sickness in Europe. It's quite magical, actually.
It looks it.
No, it's. I'm sure there are some flaws over here somewhere.
If Instagram's anything to go by, that's not news to me that Europe's great and Melbourne's not right now.
No. It's weird being here because being able to see everyone taking the photos of themselves, it's wildly accurate. Everyone is having that much fun. It's incredible. After the 67th shot of herself that this girl took yesterday, she was having a great time. Looked at me. Looked like she was having heaps of fun.
Yeah, you did send Josh and I a video of that. It was the most, I don't know where you are, but that's the most picturesque, most beautiful scenery, landscape I've ever seen in my entire life. There was someone just taking a photo of their face over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think it's definitely gotten worse. The taking photos of the selfies on holiday. Anyway, I'll get off my high horse. I'm 85.
We should probably get into today's episode anyway. We're very lucky to have Dr. M back again. I actually listened to Dr. Emisode number 5 in the car on the way here, and it was just at a time on emotions, and I needed to hear it. So it was a great episode, Em. It was a really good episode. Well done for your last episode. It was wonderful.
Thank you. I'm very glad to hear that.
It was great.
So today, I guess we should get into it. What episode did you want to, or what part of which episode were you hoping to chat about?
So there is a part of Harry Garside's episode that I wanted to pick up. That was what a remarkable man, first of all, and an incredible episode. So well done. But having said this, I feel as though what I'm going to talk about actually is going to be relevant pretty much for all of the episodes that have been done before. But I felt like there was a particular part of what he said that kind of exemplified the workings of the inner critic, which is what I wanted to explore today.
That sounds good. I was a little bit worried you're about to diss Harry Garside then. He said he's a wonderful, what an incredible man, but...
Nothing bad to say at all.
And will this be relevant to people who aren't elite athletes like Harry and Hugh, or is it just for elite athletes?
Yeah, this is only aimed at one person in this podcast. No, this is the thing I think feels very important is that it is a common human experience. We all have an inner critic. So regardless of your status or your athletic ability, it's relevant for all of us.
Oh yeah. I mean, the inner critic. I mean, I'm in the middle of writing at the moment, and the inner critic in my experience, it doesn't matter how much you're aware of it. It's just it keeps on coming back, and it just is so convincing. you can so easily, I guess this is your inner critic, you can so easily go from one moment thinking that I know exactly what I'm doing. I deserve to be here. I'm really good at this. And then the next morning, you look at the same idea that you thought was brilliant yesterday, and you're like, what was I thinking? This is shit. I'm shit.
We'd had a chat through our Slack channel about what today would be about. And Em suggested this, and you both emphatically said, yes, we have to do that. That's such a great topic. And I don't know if I was arrogantly, but I thought, I don't think I've ever had huge issues with that. But I've just been paying attention to it recently. And this morning, I went to the Melbourne Storm to just deliver a one-off sort of 30, 45-minute presentation to the players there.
Were you invited? Or just rocked up?
Yes, I
was just driving past Melbourne Storm, and I thought, you know what? I might pop in, do a 30 to 45-minute talk.
My inner critic said, they could... You should go in there and do a talk.
Yeah. No, so
can I just say that's actually what we call shameless grandiosity. As a side note.
I love that.
It's great.
Okay, next episode, shameless grandiosity.
I'll come back to that. Yep.
Yeah.
So I had the Melbourne Storm today, and I love the Melbourne Storm. I've done a lot of work with them. That's where I first started all this work with Elite Sport and have a great relationship with them. But I haven't spoken there in a very long time. Anyway, they reached out and said, through a guy called Brian Phelan, he said, would you come and speak to the players? And I'm just paying attention to the inner critic because I knew we were doing it today. And I set up my presentation. It's ready to go. The players are walking in from training. And I actually made notes on all my negative self-talk. And it was, here's some of the stuff I said to myself, right? And here's someone thinking, I've never really had an issue with an inner critic. Mm-hmm. Here's some of the stuff I said to myself. And I wrote it all down the second I left the Melbourne Storm session. So the first thing I thought was, as they're walking in, my presentation's up on the screen. And I thought to myself, the inner critic said, you haven't done a face-to-face presentation in 2 months. You are going to be so rusty. The last one I did was sort of back in May. Then the next thing I thought was, you're extremely self-deprived, so you'll probably stutter. I do have an issue sometimes with stuttering when I'm particularly nervous or sleep deprived, and I thought, you'll probably stutter today. And then I thought to myself, a few of the players were introducing themselves as they walked in, they were new faces, and I thought, the younger players have no idea who you are. Like, you're a no one to those guys. Then I thought, there'll also be players here that actually don't want to be sitting here listening to you speak. They'd rather be going home. They're stuck listening to you. Then I thought, you're not wearing very cool clothes today, because these boys wear the coolest clothes. I was like, look what you're wearing. That's just crap. And they'll be thinking this guy wears crap clothes. Then I thought my hair was very flat, and I was trying to make it go up a bit more because it was just really flat. And I was thinking, 5 guys here have just heard you speak like a month ago. They did not want to be here listening to this. And that was all in the space of 3 minutes before I got introduced. So someone who thinks I don't have an inner critic, it appears that I do. And by the way, the talk went so well, and I loved it, and it was great. And all logical thought would suggest it would be great. Like, I love that place. I have such a great relationship with them, but I still found all these things were just like telling myself. Anyway, thanks for the episode, Em. It's been great having you.
I actually think that is a brilliant example. And honestly, in the space of 3 minutes, the litany of negative predictions and negative thoughts that the mind can come up with is quite amazing, really.
Yeah.
But I want to commend you on noticing it, because I think you're absolutely right, is that sometimes we can walk around not recognizing that it's actually commentating and making evaluations of us, sometimes on a moment-to-moment basis. So I think that can be quite powerful, just to recognize, there it is. But I will get into a little bit more of that in a second. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
Do you want to listen to some audio?
Yeah. If you've got Harry's little clip, then that would be great.
What a treat.
play that little section.
I've been working with my psychologist and my life coach around, like, what are the things that drive me the most in my sporting career. And I think a big thing was I never felt like I was good enough when I was younger. I'd always lose. I felt different to my brothers. Many things play into it. So I'm trying to change the tone with how I treat myself, because the reality is I want to have kids in the next 3-4 years. And of course, I'm not going to be perfect when that happens, but I don't want them. I feel sometimes like I'm inferior or I'm not good enough or something. I don't want that to pass that on to my kids. Yeah. So the big push for me, of course, I want to get better and treat myself better. But a big thing is as well, I want to be a better dad when that time comes. I want to be a good good person, a good dad, and I want to be a good role model.
And so these are things you'd say to the mirror basically in the morning.
Yeah. So it'd be things like, I am enough, I am worthy of love, I am world champion, and then I am powerful, I am beautiful. So many things that I go through. So I've got a big list. I can send you a little list. But there's just like little sticky notes to remind myself. But I've been doing that consistently for a while now, and I have noticed a little shift in self. There's many other things that play into that as well, but it's a nice shift.
God,
Well, it's nice to hear his voice again.
I know, he's a self-development machine, isn't he? He's so good at it.
I thought there are two major things in that little excerpt that I thought were really relevant for talking about the inner critic. The first is what Harry mentioned around what was motivating him around not being good enough. And I think that's something that we could really explore a little bit further. But then also there's another part to that where he was using positive affirmations. And I think actually I might even just start with that and then we can kind of work backwards a little. What he's done there, I think, is really the way he described that was really important, and that is that he's kind of changed the tone in terms of how he speaks to himself, and then uses these positive affirmations. And I think he's done that in such a beautiful way. But, and this is definitely not a criticism of him at all, I want to make that clear. Sometimes for some of us, the use of positive affirmations don't necessarily result in, or doesn't necessarily result in, a sense of well-being or happiness in a way that we think it might.
Yeah, I did feel like when he was saying that, I did feel like if I said that, I would feel like it was kind of forced, or I could tell that I'm lying. Like if I was standing in front of the mirror at the start of a day and I didn't feel like I was going to be creative or productive that day, and I looked at myself and I said, you are productive, you are smart, you are creative, you are whatever, my inner critic would just be going, bullshit, 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 mate.
Yep. The use of positive affirmations or positive self-statements can be really fraught with some difficulty. In fact, Russ Harris, who is a psychologist and a big proponent of acceptance and commitment therapy, he proposes that the brain works in a way of addition rather than subtraction. So what I mean by that is that if you have a positive self-statement and we tell ourselves like, I am beautiful, it doesn't work to take away the negative belief that sits underneath there. It just adds on top. So it doesn't actually get rid of it. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
And so what tends to happen, particularly if we are having a difficult day, or if there is a history of anxiety or depression that's been around, when you speak to yourself with those positive affirmations, particularly if they feel kind of quite large, like I am beautiful, I am wonderful, I am strong, if they're of that kind of intensity, what happens is that it very, very quickly triggers the underbelly of that, which is that inner critic. And so there was research done in 2009 by Wood and colleagues, and I think this is quite a pivotal piece of research really, and it compared the use of positive self-statements with people who have high self-esteem and people who have low self-esteem. And it actually, I think the title of it was Power for Some and Peril for Others. And what it showed was that for people that have a high self-esteem, when they practice the positive self-statements, it produces a little bit of a feeling of well-being or like a little bit of happiness. But for the people that had lower self-esteem, it actually made them feel worse.
Gosh. But there's a lot of people out there saying do positive self-talk.
Yeah. It's because it's like, so essentially what you're saying, Em, is like if the result of that could be if I stood in front of the mirror and said, you are beautiful, or I am beautiful, I am powerful, or I am deserved of this opportunity, or I deserve to be here, whatever it might, big things like that, then the inner critic, that triggers the inner critic to go like, no, you're not. No, you're not. So you're not powerful. You're not beautiful. You're not. And I can so see that how that would happen. It's like it's giving the inner critic the fuel it requires. Maybe it could, but obviously not for Harry. But yeah.
And I do want to make a note that there is certainly a space for this, for the use of positive self-statements, and we can see that when it comes to the practice of compassion and loving kindness meditations, which I'll talk about later. But I think it's a useful point to start off in just checking in with yourself. Like when you say those things to yourself, what actually happens? And maybe for some of us, it actually kind of does trigger this underbelly, those more long-held, long-known thoughts that we have about ourselves, if that makes sense.
That's, interesting. Harry's an interesting person to pick a beef with him. I'm not sure I'd be...
Oh, and I really didn't mean for it to sound like that either.
But I love that you brought this up because I think so many people, it's such a pop concept, or like a lot of people are in so many different wellbeing books or self-help stuff. It says like, do positive affirmations every single morning. And I think a lot of people would do them relentlessly, just going, well, it says to do them. And you hear it and you go, yeah, it makes sense. I can see how that would work. But just to be aware, like, is it working for you? Because I think from what you're saying, for a lot of people the people who desperately look for this stuff and need this stuff because they have some underlying issues are quite vulnerable. And then they do this without questioning, hang on, is it actually more of a potent reminder that I don't think I'm beautiful, really? So I think it's great that you've brought this up.
Please take all of this with some lightness and know that, just check in with yourself as to whether this is relevant or not relevant for you. And certainly there is a space for that kind of work, for positive affirmations. But just again, like checking in, like, does this really sit okay with me? And how does it land when I hear that information? I thought maybe going back from that, then looking at really, well, what is this inner critic? And because we can speak about it like, here is this inner critic, but what actually is it? And Hugh, in your example at the beginning where you talked about all those thoughts, I mean, really in some ways we can say that they're automatic negative thoughts that are showing up. But another way that we can think about the inner critic, there's lots of different terms really, but it's like the evaluator, the judge, that inner dialogue.
Protector.
Yes, exactly. Yep. And the origins of that are really interesting and important, I think. So Dan Siegel, who I've spoken about before, American professor of psychiatry, he terms the inner critic the checker. And I think that's sometimes a useful way of understanding what that is.
Yeah.
And he says that because it's based upon, well, what he says, it's based upon millions of years of evolution, that we have this part of our brain that is constantly checking for safety. And I know that I've spoken a lot about kind of the evolutionary principles around fight or flight, but really that capacity for this inner narration is this checker part of you. So it checks the environment, brings about some alert focus, and then its next function is to motivate behaviour of some kind.
So
that makes a lot of sense.
Maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but that checker, because I feel like I've read or I've been told at one point that often the kind of the reason for anxiety coming about. So if anxiety comes about in you and that kind of and a fear, a mental fear that you have, comes from a place of protection as well. It's like the anxiety is almost there because it's trying to. It's got good intentions, so to speak, in the sense that it's trying to protect you from the thing that you fear the most. But in bringing up the thing that you fear the most, it puts that idea in your head. So I guess my question, would be then, at what point does that negative self-talk or that inner critic turn into anxiety? Like, is there a difference or is it essentially the same thing?
I think that's a good question.
Yes.
I'd probably start off by saying that we all have this inner critic. The difference is how we discern when to listen to it and when not to. In terms of how it translates into anxiety, yes, there is this voice that is constantly evaluating your performance, and that that can be a big driver of anxiety. It's kind of difficult to unpack because there are all of these sensations in the body and the changes in your physiology when we encounter a threat. And so in some ways it's like all part of each other. So it's probably a bit hard to disentangle.
Yeah.
But the inner critic is certainly a feature of anxiety and lots of different kind of pathologies.
I mean, like even as I asked it, and as you're answering, I guess I started thinking, well, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe that's just a label, like whether it's anxiety or inner critic or negative self-talk. In the moment, does it really matter what the label is? All that matters is understanding what it is in terms of like how to get through it or understanding the origins of it. Maybe that's actually what's more important than saying, is this anxiety or is this this or is this that?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Great. Wow. Good question. Good point.
So
where are you, Josh?
yeah.
I am nowhere, to be honest. Sickness is...
Poor Josh is sick as a dog.
Yeah, I've all the tests I've been doing say I don't have COVID, but the way that I'm thinking, and I feel like I'm about 50 points down on my usual IQ and really struggling to follow things, so maybe I do.
So just to come back to that example, so it's healthy to listen to them, but then also, is it a good thing to maybe just to go, okay, thanks, checker. I appreciate you checking for me, and that's good. You've checked that. I've also done my own checks and balances, and I reckon I'm going to be right here, or whatever it is. Or you're right. You're right. There are some people that may not like this, but that's thanks for letting me know.
Yeah,
almost treating it like a nagging. I don't have a nagging mother, but like, mums like will go, have you got your coat? Have you done this? I don't think you should do this today. Maybe have you thought about that? Maybe treating it like that. I don't know. Mum, if you're listening, you're not the reference point for this.
Yes. And I think that's what you're saying there is really important. And I think if it's okay with you guys, I'd really like to explore that in a little bit more detail in terms of how we work with that inner critic and how we approach that inner voice. But absolutely spot on, Hugh. That would be, certainly an approach I'd be looking at kind of really cultivating a bit more of. I wonder before we get there whether it might be useful to explore how it is that this voice does develop and particularly the kinds of things that it will say.
Yes.
And so when I would be working with anyone that is experiencing like quite a strong inner critic, one of the first things I'd be kind of having a look at is, how old this voice feels to you. And I have to say that in asking that question, most people will say it is a really old voice.
As in like old...
Sorry. I just had an image of a really old man coming in.
That's what I thought you meant.
Oh,
I
no.
thought it was like an old person. Like, they're probably like in their late 70s. They've just clocked off from lawn bowls. It's Saturday afternoon and they're pouring a sherry. That's my inner critic. Beryl.
So, yeah, that is not what I was meaning.
Okay.
How old does this voice feel to you, as in how long have you known this voice? How long has this voice shown up to you in your life? And it would be very rare for me to say that I've heard anyone say this is a new voice. I've only noticed this in the last year. Most often that voice feels like something that you have heard or known since you were little.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Does it often happen, because I'm thinking my own one, I feel like it arrived at about my beginning of my teenage years, like 10 or 11 would have been. So like...
Yep, it can be then, and it can also be earlier than that too.
Yeah, right.
But it might be that 10 might be the first... 10 or 11 might be the first time in which you noticed it or you can remember it. Yeah.
Did you, Josh, just wondering if you had your inner critic when you threw a tennis ball into my back? It's for those of you who are new to the podcast, Josh and I have never, ever had a fight or a disagreement before. There was just one time he got angry at me and threw a tennis ball into my back, and that was it.
I reckon, I definitely remember feeling incredibly guilty about it. I don't know if guilt and inner critic are a similar thing or if they're separate.
Anyway, it's a separate one. Sorry,
real low point. It was a very real low point in my life.
A very specific interruption as well. Sorry, Em, keep going.
It's okay. So it is a long-held, usually a long-held thought that comes from our early experiences as children, and the degree to which we speak in terms of severity can be an indication of what messages we heard from our parents or primary caregivers as children. And there's this idea that if you are held harshly, you will hold yourself harshly. So if you heard a lot of criticism, what happens is that we internalize those messages. They then become our rules for understanding the world and for understanding ourselves. And then as adults, those then become the messages we tell ourselves in a really ongoing way.
Wow. Makes sense.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, also, is there the possibility that, because I'm thinking there is, on occasions, I speak to myself very harshly, like extremely harshly, sometimes out loud, but I was not, that's not our upbringing. That's what I know. That's not when I was an upbringing, but I know I can think of an example. Our kids will only eat Cheerios for breakfast. There's nothing else they'll eat. And if we don't have Cheerios, then they'll just go, no, I'm not eating, and they'll start the day with no food. And the other day, I just forgot that we'd run out. I knew we'd run out, and then all day I was like, don't forget the Cheerios. And then the next morning they asked for breakfast, and I realised I'd forgotten to get them. And I was like, I won't repeat what I said to myself, but I gave myself a real spray out loud. Mm-hmm. I'm just hearing you say that. My parents would have never done that, but I think back, they would have never have not had Cheerios ready for us. Mum was just so, give Dad a bit of credit as well, but Mum was particularly just so organised for our lives. And I felt like, I think there was a bit of me just being angry at myself for not providing what Mum and Dad provided for me, maybe. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's, like, that's not the way they spoke to me, Mum and Dad, but that's probably a bit of a different example, I guess.
No, I think that's really appropriate. So, and I should definitely add that we don't have to have grown up in an environment where there's really critical messaging. It doesn't have to be that, that we had parents that were very like verbally abusive or physically abusive, for example. It is in some ways, again, we can bring temperament to the table. So we might be more sensitive perhaps to our environments, hypothetically. But we do soak in absolutely like sponges as kids, these kind of implicit rules for living in the world.
So what you're saying that, like, I'm just thinking, as we all tend to do, I'm just thinking of myself. And so like with my teenage years, like my mum was never, she wasn't critical, but she was very caring to the extent where she was like, she just like most mothers, hopefully they want the best, and so the best for their children. Mm-hmm. And so the day, I remember probably from the day that I said to my mum, I want to be an actor, like alarm bells started going off in Mum's head of like, oh God, there's not a very good guaranteed career in that for you. Like, this is me when I was 8 or 9. Mm-hmm. So if I said that, then understandably she's sort of preparing me for and trying to help me understand that if I want to, having that as a job is not going to be an easy life, and that's her just trying to care. But maybe then, like, me hearing that back from her to go, if she's saying there's not a career in that, that's only 2% of people make a living out of acting, whatever the article said that she left on the end of my bed when I was 16. Not that I remember. Maybe that sort of then stuck with me as like a thing of like, it's very unlikely that it's going to go well for you. Mm. And that's the inner critic that I have is often around that, which is like, you're not going to be the one chosen. There's so many good people out there. Why would they choose you? Why would you get the opportunity? That's my inner critic. And I just wonder whether or not that comes from a place of my mum not criticizing or not saying I can't do it, but just like laying out the reality of the world with the intention of protecting me and preparing me the best way she could. Without being my psychologist, is that ringing any bells?
Yeah, well, the fact that you can remember in particular, I think you said when you were 8 or 9, that you told your mum, is that right?
I actually don't remember saying that, but my mum has told me that when I was, I think 8, I said that I wanted to be a comedian. Yeah.
So it's interesting because I think you're absolutely right there, that they are these messages that we take on. Again, they're not said with, malintent at all from our parents often. But we take on part of that as that is checking to say, am I going to be safe enough to be doing this? Like, am I safe enough to pursue this? And if we look really at the function of the inner critic, its role primarily is there to protect us. And it's primarily to protect us from experiences of shame or experiences of rejection and exposure to being unworthy or unlovable.
That's huge.
This may be completely wrong, but it sounds like a parent then.
Yeah.
It sounds like what was born from parents is like an inner parent.
It's really interesting.
Oh, the inner parent.
You know,
Oh.
I feel like this is very unfair on our parents.
No, yeah.
Yeah, I agree, because like I don't want them to think that I think that at all. But that's kind of the role of a parent too, to protect their child from shame, embarrassment, failure. It's kind of what you want to do as a parent. So it comes from the same place. It just sort of, it was just a similarity that I noticed that's probably very unfair.
Yeah. It's and I guess like what you're saying, where it's like it's a checker, it's checking to see if I think you said checking to see whether you're lovable or whether you're good enough, and because that to me feels like such a subjective measure. And maybe the measure that we're checking it against in my case, what my mother said to me, like, you know, her measure or her, you know, when you're, you know, for me, it's like when you're growing up, you believe that your parents know everything. You believe that your parents have it all worked out, you know, and so I think like probably as a teenager, I'm like, well, she knows that it's like very, very unlikely that I could ever have a career or be good enough to make it in this industry that I love so much. And so probably then without even thinking about it, my checker is going like, well, remember, the fact is that it's very unlikely that you'll make it. Like, that's the fact. Because the fact for me is what my mum said when I was a teenager, and that becomes my encyclopedia for the rest of my life.
Oh, there's something that you said in there that really made me think of a beautiful TED talk by Shirzad Chamine, and I'll pass this on. But he talks about this in more reference to kind of trauma experiences when we're little. But the part there, Ryan, where you said about our parents being right, is that, you know, I'm not sure if you guys can remember the point at which you recognized your parents actually being vulnerable, imperfect, flawed human beings. For some of us, it might be like in our early adolescence. For some of us, it may not be until like our late 20s. But what he explains is that, and it's such a beautiful TED talk, but he begins by saying that we are all born believing we are awesome, which is lovely. Yeah. But at some point along the way, and sometimes very early on, we come to recognize that's not the truth. That's not true anymore. And in an example where, for example, we might be in a critical environment, an environment where there's neglect or even like highly perfectionistic messaging, if as a little kid you come to believe or know that your parents are flawed and imperfect, that would be absolutely terrifying because your life is in their hands. And so a child does not want to feel unsafe because they have this knowledge that their parents are flawed. We need to believe that our parents are capable, not flawed, and perfect in many ways. And so what happens instead is that the messages that they tell us then become that inner voice that we tell ourselves. So they mustn't love me because I do these things wrong. Or I am unlovable because I've done these things. If only I was to do more of these things, then I would be lovable. And so that voice really started off so little, but it started off because it would have been far too painful for us to recognise the fallibility of our parents or our primary caregivers.
Rather say the fallibility in yourself or blame yourself. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, wow.
Exactly.
Gee, that's massive.
So that we'll put that TED Talk in the show notes. I just imagine a lot of people out walking, listening to the podcast, going to their notes and going, "Okay, so how do I spell that? What's the?" So it'll be in the show notes. But that sounds
he's incredible. It's a really beautiful TED Talk. But I think it can be a very important message for us to recognize that was not our fault. That was that little kid doing whatever it needed to do to make sense of the world in a way that was manageable and safe enough for us.
Fascinating.
I can't help but try and, as you're talking, and I think maybe a lot of people listening will be doing the same, but I'm just thinking about how do I practically put all this together so when I'm about to do a talk or whatever it is and the inner critic's always there, the first thing I've taken away from this is to say to myself, okay, thanks, checker. I appreciate you doing those checks. And instead of not arguing back with it, but just saying, really appreciate that. That's great. But I reckon, it's almost like the anti-risk taker almost. Like it's going, well, a bit of a risk. There's probably no point. You don't need to do this. That's kind of what it feels like to me in a lot of situations. My inner critic it's just done a bit of an assessment on the environment and go, a bit of a risk. Let's not do this.
The thing that has really helped me, actually, because I've always heard the term inner critic and I kind of had a vague idea of what it was, and you can recognize your inner critic. But actually, in talking about it with you, it's actually more helpful to give the inner critic a personality, like an actual persona. And in my case, and this is no criticism to my mum at all, but it is actually helpful to think about my inner critic as my mum, not because she's critical, but because she is looking out for me, and she's always been trying to make sure that I'm safe, or I'm all these things. And so when she says these things, she's not being critical. So I think if I then apply that to my inner critic now, where it's like if I'm ever thinking, it's very unlikely you're going to get chosen for this, it's very unlikely that your show's going to be picked up, or that people are going to laugh at the jokes that you do on the Imperfects this episode, whatever. All of that is just, it's not an inner critic. It's actually probably comes from my mum saying like, she's just worried for me. She's just worried. And so knowing the intention and the why behind those comments is actually really helpful for me, because I know it's actually not legitimate criticism. It's not a personal attack or a criticism. It's just a person like my mum saying like, just be careful, okay? And just know that not everyone laughs at all jokes. Some people don't find things funny, and that's okay. If that's the voice, it's kind of more helpful and not as not as harsh or something.
Oh, my heart is bursting at that whole explanation. That's absolutely spot on in terms of, this way in which we can work with that inner critic. And, this whole process really is around actually uncovering where this voice is coming from and what it looks like, and also what function it has been serving. And that point in there is that it has been serving this function to kind of look out for me, but actually I can look out for myself too. And so that process really is around kind of what we'd say is like befriending the inner critic. And if you think about like when you're making a new friend, you meet someone for the first time, we bring such a, well, hopefully, like such a curiosity to getting to know someone. So there's like an openness, an inquisitive part of us that wants to know more about this person, and we can apply those same principles to getting to know and befriend our inner critic. So we can hold that with much more lightness rather than such a sense of contraction, tenseness, pressure that comes when we hear that inner critic otherwise.
It's quite counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely, Josh.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the reaction, because it's to think of them as a friend is this, because if someone was to come up to me and speak like that, I would retract and run away from them physically. So it seems strange to want to welcome that in, or at least it seems counterintuitive and odd, but I can totally see how it helps.
Yeah. because it's like when my voice comes in, I think now if I see it as like my mum, God, mum loves these episodes with you, Emily, and she is going to hate this episode. But anyway, but yeah, when I hear the voice now, I think what I'll hear is one of like care. And I think that does completely reframe it. I mean, I know it will still be hard in the moment when that inner critic is yelling at me saying like, well, I don't know about this. It will still be hard to but I'm also kind of like, I guess as I was listening to this and everyone talk, and I'm also, well, hearing myself talk about my personal experience with inner critic, I'm also hyper aware of the fact that my personal experience with inner critic is pretty mild compared to like a lot of people's inner critic when it comes to like legitimate trauma. So like if it's like something that's coming from a much harsher place, and it's something that is like an inner critic that, or maybe that isn't inner critic then, and maybe that is more like a severe anxiety thing. I don't know. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like where it's like, it's, I think what I'm trying to say is it's easy for me to say, oh yeah, just pretend it's your mum and you'll be fine. Easy for me to say in my position, but obviously a lot of people have different experiences.
I think that for a lot of us it can be, long-term work, really, to be honest. And so absolutely, it's not just as simple as saying like, oh, it's actually just a funny character in my mind, let's just ignore it. I think it really does take quite a bit of deliberate, focused practice, attention for us to work with this inner critic in a more compassionate way. It doesn't come quickly, I've got to be honest. This is really just an invitation to start to think about how this particular inner narrator shows up in my life. And there are some really helpful things that can get you started, but particularly for kind of early childhood experiences of trauma, this does take quite a bit of time. But there is always a way and a place to start, which I think is important. And that first place really is just noticing that there is this part of me that shows up and it says all these awful things. But what's really interesting to me is that if you were to survey our inner critics, we'll often come up with the same thoughts. So people, we can kind of almost categorize them very easily. And the fact that there are these common thoughts that show up, I mean, what does that tell you, I wonder? Like that these are common thoughts, not just unique to me.
It almost, to me, the fact that everyone has them makes them all at once sound like they're important and also render them kind of meaningless at the same time because they're not attached to reality. Yeah. Did that make sense? I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I should be on this podcast today.
No, not at all.
I can't tell if that's you speaking or your inner critic speaking. It's actually coming through your microphone. It's so strong. You pick up that noise in your brain.
That's incredible. Wow.
It's been on overdrive throughout this whole thing. We're just sitting here.
And would it be okay? Would you be able to list off a couple of examples of things that generally, in your experience, what are those really common things that the inner critic says?
Yep. Okay. So things like you're fat, you're ugly, you're stupid, you're useless, I'm unlovable. Is that kind of sounding familiar?
Yeah.
Any of those sorts of things?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I could go on because there are quite a few more, but they're very generic. But we say them with such intensity and they feel very isolating when those thoughts show up.
So just, and I don't want to go down this other rabbit hole because this is a whole other thing, but like you're fat, you're ugly, like those, like I feel like every single person, like I don't consider myself, I'm not a fat person. I know that. But there are many times where I look at myself in the mirror and I do think that, and Hugh, you've spoken about your feelings around this and like body image and stuff like that. But does that thought, does that come from, because I feel like that's a different voice that I'm hearing. When someone says that's not my mum. Like that hasn't come from me as a child. That hasn't come from my experience back then. That's probably come from comparison with other people, and it's come from, general societal standards or aspirations of what a body should look like. So is that different, or is it sort of a similar thing?
It can be similar. It can be an incarnation of the inner critic, like a different aspect or a different character of the inner critic in some ways. But again, that comparison, that comparison or that comparative tendency shows up again, like when we're really little, and when you go into like primary school, for example. We are immediately thrown into this experience of evaluation and comparison. And the research, this is a bit overwhelming to me, but the research suggests for girls, I don't know what it is for boys, I've got to be honest, but that for girls by year 3, they have a perception of their body image as good or bad by that age.
9. They're 9 years old. 8 years old.
Yeah. And I suspect it probably might even be earlier than that. But we sit in this such a comparative environment, which is like fertile ground really for that inner critic to do its work, and that is to check and make sure if I fit, if I belong, and if I'm different, then we get shame.
Wow. Yeah, it's really interesting. I just wanted to just jump on what Ryan said before about him having a picture of his mum being that voice. Funnily enough, I as he was saying that, I'd already had a picture in my head of it being me, but a much smaller version, like wearing a suit with a clipboard and like really, like almost like the very small, anxious accountant version of me.
That's what you imagine.
Yeah, that's what I imagine. And like a little version of me running up going, sorry, I know you're about to do a talk, but just very quickly, you are extremely tired, just so you know. That means you might stutter. And also there are some guys here that I've just had a look around and I don't reckon they're too keen on this session. So I was picturing that, like this little accountant version of Hugh, like with a clipboard saying it, and then me like being really nice to it and going, almost like I'm the coach and it's the assistant coach, like going, like putting my arm around it going, thank you, Matt. I really appreciate that. It's so good to know that. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I'm going to do it anyway, but I do appreciate, like, you've done such a great job there. You've done a great recon on this situation. I'm good. Thank you so much. Is that weird that I thought that?
No, but like, I mean, when you first said it, I actually thought that you meant that's what you've always been imagining, but what you're saying is that's what you're going to start imagining. Is that what you're saying?
No, it's just the first thing, as soon as I was thinking we need to give it a personality, yes. I think Em said give it a personality. The first thing I thought was a small version of me in a suit looking very nervous and worried and with a clipboard. I don't know if that's strange, but that's what I went to. But it's already in my head. I'm not saying it's going to fix everything and I'll still have it, but it's being nice to it. Because I think a lot of things I read before are like, tell that inner critic to fuck off and like just be amazing and stuff. But to me, I'm like, just what you said there, I can picture myself being really nice to it and going, great stuff. You have done, not in a patronizing way, but bloody good job. You've checked the scenario and I'm going to do it anyway.
Look, I think that's a fabulous example. And if we pick up on that idea about giving it a personality, and we use this a lot in acceptance and commitment therapy, if you imagine those things that the inner critic says, and there might be like kind of the hit parade of commentary that it has, and if we take, like we could just take one line or one particular thought that it says, and maybe it's like, oh, you're useless, you're never going to be able to do that. If we take that voice and then we turn it into like a caricature or give it like, turn it into a cartoon character. So maybe it becomes like Donald Duck, for example. And then you imagine Donald Duck saying those words to you. How does that feel to you when you say in a Donald Duck voice, you're useless, you're never going to amount to anything? What happens?
I was really hoping you'd do the voice then.
I wasn't even going to give it a try.
I feel like I used to be able to do it as a kid, Donald Duck, but I wouldn't try now. Yeah. For some reason, I think like Donald Duck, I mean, I used to like Donald Duck as a kid, but when I was thinking about like what would be a funny cartoon character, I mean, this is not a cartoon character, but I was thinking George Costanza. I was like, George Costanza doing that, I think is sort of a funny character to do it because he is a very worrying guy and very cautious and does it can it be a live action character? Does that hold stead?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good.
It can really, this process is about externalizing this inner critic so that we're getting some distance from it. So I am not like, and much like I've spoken in my previous episode, that I am not my thoughts. By bringing awareness to these sayings or commentaries from my inner critic, by externalizing it and making it a different character, or even just noticing that it's here, we're really able to observe that experience in a different way. And coming back to my favorite topic of the brain, when we start to externalize it, we start to use the prefrontal cortex, which really dampens down the threat center, which is where that inner critic really originates, in the amygdala. So the externalizing process, naming it something, imagining what it looks like. You could draw it even if you wanted to. So again, like lots of different ways in which you can create what's basically like a meta awareness or like metacognitive awareness.
Incredible.
Amazing. So good, Em.
Oof. Wow.
The other part of this, like once we can externalize it, then is bringing in of self-compassion. And I think that the work of self-compassion is really important. And I think this is also where I got the sense that Harry Garside has done a lot of work around this kind of cultivating of that more compassionate voice and the kind voice, and even just in the use of the word, like the tone with which he speaks to himself. So one of the interesting things about self-compassion is that it, for some people, we might notice that there's a lot of aversion to the idea of being compassionate to yourself. And one of the reasons for that is that we can often feel, or there's this myth around self-compassion, in fact, that being compassionate to myself will somehow be or equal laziness, complacency, or basically not getting done what I want to get done. Because there's this belief that the inner critic is actually what motivates me. It actually is what gets me to do things, and it's what's got me to get this far so far.
Mm-hmm.
So there can be a really big fear that if I let in self-compassion, that I will actually stop being productive. Does that resonate at all?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I immediately think from like a creative point of view, but you often hear people who, particularly like, you often hear songwriters, like musicians, you often hear like if they're creating work or writing songs based off some sort of, either from some sort of like trauma, like, they've gone through something, whether it be a breakup or something, family, and that sort of provides so much of the fuel for their work, or what's actually, you hear as being very common is if a musician like takes a lot of drugs or drinks a lot, and they've made a career based on being drunk or high, and then they become clean, they often worry that if they change their way of being, that they're not going to be able to do what they do. And it reminds me of this. It's like if we change the way that if we change our state or we change our process in some way, it could negatively affect the good work we've been doing, which is ironic considering the thing that we want to change is the thing telling us that our work is no good. Like that's such a strange thing. But I don't know if is that what you were talking about? Like rather than
yeah. And it's yes, absolutely, and it's a little bit like almost like the notion of the carrot or the stick. And I'll give you an example. If you imagine that a child is learning to ride a bike, well, actually no, let's do two children. We've got the first child, and maybe they're, I don't know, let's just say 6, and they're learning to ride a bike for the first time, and their dad is in the background saying, you better not fall off. Don't fall off. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Oh my God, you've fallen off. Such an idiot. What's wrong with you? Why don't you know how to do this yet? You're never going to be able to learn to ride a bike. You're going to be useless.
Yep.
So we've got that experience of that little child learning to ride a bike for the first time. And then we've got a different parent and a different child. And that child is riding along and the parent is like, yeah, you're doing a good job. Oh, that looks like you're going to fall off. Oh, no, you've fallen off. And then when that child falls off, the parent comes up to the child and says, oh, ouch, like that looks like that really hurt. Oh, that mustn't be good, feeling like that at the moment. All right, let's take a breath, dust yourself off. What can we do to get you back on the bike? What do you really need from me right now to help you learn how to do this a little bit more easily? And so we've got these two examples of basically like the punitive parent or the kind and compassionate parent. And the question then is like, well, which child will learn to ride the bike more easily? And do you have a sense of that?
I'm hoping it's the second one.
I don't know. I feel like the first one would maybe learn to do the practical side of it quicker because of the fear, but the effects long term seem bad, to use a technical term.
Yes. Yeah. Look, so we don't necessarily know the answer. Like, we don't know whether which child will learn or pick up that particular task more quickly. But what we do know is that first child will definitely be motivated by fear. And in that space of fear, their performance becomes very tense and very pressured. It's functioning from a place of fight or flight. And what can happen is that child may very well learn to ride that bike quickly, but absolutely right, Ryan, in the long term, there are huge costs for us functioning from a place of threat. And that can be, very easily burnout, exhaustion, anxiety. So we can kind of oscillate between kind of anxiety and then depletion and depression and collapse. So that's like that first child. It may work at the beginning. But in the long term, the costs are really significant. And sometimes what that translates to...
Sorry, Em, the greatest probably public example of that of recent times is probably Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods, who, had that punitive parent, and it worked in the sense that he became really, really good at golf. But then, I can't think of anyone who's experienced exhaustion and burnout and then crumbling life around him like his was, that's...
Andre Agassi is another similar scenario.
Oh, Agassi, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that if we translate that in terms of like inner dialogue, that those voices then become our own kind of driving force. I see this a lot in terms of highly perfectionistic people, and that there's a reluctance to let go of those kind of unrelenting critical standards, because if I let go of them, the fear is I won't be able to perform. But the performance that they're engaging in currently feels so hard. That there is this unrelenting standard. And I think we've kind of spoken about this before, but when there are such strong driving inner critic forces, when you achieve the goal that you've set yourself to achieve and you get it, in those instances, you often just feel relief at having avoided failure rather than joy for having achieved or pride for having achieved what you've set yourself out to achieve. So that inner critic doesn't allow much space in many ways for us to feel joyful or engaged or present or curious. Does that kind of resonate with you?
Very strongly.
Yeah, well, I was wondering, when you were giving that example, I was thinking I wasn't sure how it was going to relate to the inner critic, but it's so... It almost it makes me feel like we need to invent a new character in our head, which is the opposite of the inner critic. It's the inner optimist, and it just like... maybe it's the tall version of me with cool hair, and he's like just relaxing, runs up and goes, yeah, that's very true. There are 6 guys who have heard this before, but there's actually 25 people who've never heard you speak before. Or like, I don't know, but that might be a harder one to kind of, you get to really force yourself to do that. I don't know.
Yep. No, that is absolutely it's like the cultivation of the inner nurturer.
Inner nurturer. Yep.
Or I think, or there are lots of different, versions. One of my other favourite people, obviously, that I talk about all the time is Rick Hansen, and he calls it like you're in a cheering committee, so that you can imagine like all of these people, and they might even be people that actually are in your life. So maybe in your mind you can hold in like this cheerleading squad of the people that are genuinely supportive of you in your life, and that we can hold both an awareness of this inner nurturer and then also pay attention to those warning signs of the inner critic, and we can say, yes, I can see you there, and I know you've got some important information, but I think I've got this. Like, I'm okay with this. So it is absolutely this cultivation of the inner nurturer that gives us more resources and can allow us to move in the direction of our values rather than to keep us really safe, which is what the inner critic wants to do.
Yeah, I love that. And I also, again, I wonder how important it is that you don't treat them like they're in competition yelling at each other. Like if you just say like you're all on the same, you're all trying to achieve the same thing. You all want the talk to go well or whatever it is. You want the creative piece of writing to go well. And they're chatting to each other and it's all civil. They all get on really well. And then you could maybe imagine the inner critic going, oh, that's such a good point, inner nurturer. Well done. I didn't think of that. Go for it. He's right. Or something rather than like, because I think everyone's natural thing is to have the inner optimist going, fuck off, inner critic. Listen to me, but I think you should make them all friends. That's just my completely non-educated opinion on that.
Yep, absolutely. So the other aspect to this, which I mentioned just before, is this experience of self-compassion. And the way in which obviously we'd think about self-compassion is this capacity to extend a sense of kindness and care for our own experience. And as you probably are aware, most of us are quite good at doing this for other people, but it becomes a real challenge to do this for ourselves. And there is some difficulty in practicing self-compassion because what it often will open up to are feelings of grief or old memories of when I didn't receive that kind of care and support from my primary caregivers, for example. So compassion is really rooted in what's called the attachment system. And attachment is a massive, massive area of research and psychology. So I'm not going to go into that today. But in essence, it's how we understand ourselves in relation to our parents and the world. But if you grew up in an environment where there was this experience of abuse or neglect, what will happen is it's almost like the attachment book closes at that chapter of abuse and neglect. It's almost like it shuts down that capacity for you to be and experience compassion because it wasn't happening in your environment. And so we kind of then become dissociated from experiences of kindness and compassion because they're not happening in that environment. So it's like it gets turned off. And so then as an adult, if you come to therapy, for example, or even if you're just practicing on your own, when someone extends a sense of compassion to you or you try and cultivate some compassion for yourself, it's like it opens the book back up at where the chapter closed. So when we open the book back up, we can sometimes get flooded with all of those old memories of kind of emotional deprivation or emotional abuse. And we get exposed to this really strong feeling of grief. So compassion work and grief often kind of go hand in hand. But that's not to say that compassion, is something that we can cultivate even if we've had those experiences.
That's so good, Em. Thank you so much.
Amazing.
That's such an important component of this whole topic. I think it's a lovely place to finish. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And I have to say, you've done an incredible job. You've managed Ryan on a 35-second delay. Josh, I think, might have died in the last half an hour while we're talking. I'm just trying to tell stories about the Melbourne storm the whole time. And you've put up with all that from the other side of the country. You've done, and for the listeners who, if you're listening to this and you think, no, it's all seemed pretty smooth to me, that's because Jamison has done an incredible job editing this episode. So, Em, you've done so incredibly well today to manage all that via Zoom. And Jam, thanks for making this sound not as bad as clunky as it has been.
No pressure.
But it's...
Thank you. This is a topic I could speak about for, actually probably could do a year's worth of episodes on the Inner Critic. So thanks for giving me some grace to do that. Yep.
I was thinking as you were saying that, I reckon there could be a follow-up episode on this because everyone has an inner critic, and it's something that we don't think too much about. But I think it's an issue for a lot of us. And to hear you speak about it the way you did today, there's obviously so much we can be doing in a practical sense to try and, well, not silence it, but just work with it a little bit better. So Em, thank you so much. A wonderful Dr. Emisode. I did want to tell a story about the Bourne Cinema, but let's leave that.
park it.
The next episode. My inner critic has been howling at me for the last 10 minutes, going, "Do not tell the story," and I think I'll listen to it on this occasion.
It's a good discernment.
Thank you, Em. Lovely to see you, and we really appreciate your wonderful insight and expertise.
Absolutely.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks,
I'll
Em.
see you soon.
If this episode has been triggering for you, we strongly recommend Lifeline on 131114. The Imperfects is hosted and co-produced by Hugh Van Cuylenberg, Ryan Shelton and Josh Van Cuylenberg. This episode was produced by Bridget Northeast, edited by Jamison Moore, filmed by Andy Poole and social mediated by George Martin. A special thanks to Dr. M for her expertise and guidance. We'd also like to thank the Resilience Project for their ongoing support.